Waramai Midiga. Hello, friends. Beri Wagal Nania. Yurinagura Narang Gurugul. People who come from afar and who are with us virtually. I see all of you. Aboriginal people camped at this place a long, long time ago. Ninyari Nala Wagnan Mudbari Kadi Nurada. We are sitting on the very beautiful land of the Kadi people, the Spear Tree people of Sydney. To acknowledge country is to acknowledge the significance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and our pan-continental systems of government. It recognises the ancestral spirits who created the land. It acknowledges the boundaries of that land. And more importantly, it's about looking after the people who walk that land. While it's been a tradition in our community for many thousands of years, it's normally not as formal as this and is done with much more singing and dancing. But it's still the same. We honour our ancestors. Jingela with a Bayer Bugubert. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land where Aboriginal people have performed aged-old ceremonies. And within that, much music, much dance, and much celebration. Bayami, Yaban, Dungara, Garaba. I acknowledge the sophisticated knowledge systems of our peoples, and I pay respects to their ancestors for their ability to develop eco-sustainable practices on this fragile continent. I acknowledge that there also will become a time when Australia will realise that our sophisticated knowledge systems have information that they need. With the millennia of knowledge and technological advancement, there is an understanding within community that there will be a time when people come to us to rely on our knowledge of culture. That will be when their systems fail to provide for them. Only then will they realise that our songs, our dances, and our songlines are very sophisticated forms of not only communication, but the sharing of scientific principles. As I said, our ancestors have lived on this fragile continent for millennia. When we take hold of the messages that is in the knowledge systems that are held, we have the ability to not only sustain our country, but to restore the health of the continent and the health of all of its peoples. So we always pay our respects to all of our elders, past and present. And tonight, a particular elder, one in another community that I called a friend. So I pay my respects to all of you, to Aboriginal people in the room and watching at home, and all the young people from all the cultures and communities that you come from. For all of you hold the hopes and aspirations of this continent, and there is much work for you to do. But it is my hope and belief that we will develop a system of partnership. I have gratitude that we share this land today, but I also acknowledge the cost of that sharing, and that burden falls very much one way. But we always need to remember that underneath the concrete and the asphalt, it is Aboriginal land, and it always was, and it always will be. But there is something I need to share with you tonight. And it's a message, the last message that I had with the Emeritus Professor, but I know him as just Uncle. And Uncle and I would sign off our emails to each other while we were talking about various things, with words that Stan, your speaker, will be quite familiar with tonight. Because the Wiradjuri have a saying, and it is very, very important. It is part of their sophisticated knowledge systems based on principles around Yindi Yamara. And the way that Colin and I would share our emails and farewells would end with this phrase. And those words are Yindi Yamara Wing Hanganha. And it means many things, but it's very specific. And always before I said those words with Colin, I would say, it is our responsibility to share, because to share Yindi Yamara Wing Hanganha, means to share the wisdom of respectfully knowing how to live well in a world that is worth living in. To the family of Colin, your beloved was beloved by all. He has left a legacy that is born across many communities and many continents, but we forever hold him in our hearts and hold him dear. Nakanya.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ilona Lee, and on behalf of Plus 61J Media, I would like to welcome you all, both those who are here in person and those who have joined us by Zoom, to this inaugural Colin Tatz Memorial Lecture. Thank you, Aunty Joan Selfe, for that lovely acknowledgement of country. And I too would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Plus 61J Media is an online news publication about Australia, Israel and the Jewish world, and we have a strong commitment to social justice. When we began 5 years ago, we established a panel of experts to advise us. And the first and most senior member of that panel was Professor Colin Tatz, AO. Colin wrote for us and was always available with wisdom and good counsel. It is an honour for us to be able to remember him with this memorial lecture, which we aim to hold annually. And we thank Colin's family for giving us the permission to do so. We also want to thank the Honourable Walt Secord, Shadow Treasurer, for enabling us to use New South Wales Parliament House, as it's an appropriate venue for this important event. Shortly, I will call on Elizabeth Johnstone Kuiper to say a few words about Colin, and she will also introduce our guest speaker, Stan Grant. Walt will have the last words for the evening. Elizabeth is a company director and lawyer. She has been a friend of the Tatz family since 1971, just after they arrived in Armidale, New South Wales. Elizabeth studied with Colin at Yad Vashem in Israel during the First Gulf War, and she was an early reader of some of his books, including his autobiography. Over many decades, she regularly attended Shabbat in the Tatz home, and she tells me that she had some of the most challenging conversations of her life with Colin. Please welcome Elizabeth to share some of her memories of the late Professor Colin Tatz.
I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we meet on here tonight, and I recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tonight we remember and honour the life and career of Professor Colin Tatz. Colin's autobiography, published in 2015, was titled Human Rights and Human Wrongs, A Life Confronting Racism. And that is truly how Colin lived his life. From the early 1960s till the very end of his life, Colin challenged us to think about how we in this country have treated Indigenous Australians. Colin was Australia's leading Holocaust scholar. He led multiple trips to Israel, to the Holocaust Centre Yad Vashem. He was the founding director of what is now the Centre for Indigenous Australian Studies and the Centres for Comparative Genocide Studies and the Institute of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Colin was revered in the Australian Armenian community for being such a strong voice for that long delayed recognition of the Armenian genocide. Colin, importantly, was also part of a remarkable family, a remarkable lifelong partnership with his much-loved wife, Sandra, always his best editor. And to the very end, Sandra placed Colin first. He was also the proud and much-loved father of Paul, Karen, and sadly, Simon is in Melbourne, so unable to be with us, but Simon is very much online and very much in our thoughts tonight. Colin was the treasured Zeta, grandfather and great-grandfather of 8, some of whom are here tonight, and some are certainly watching, and brother, importantly, of Pam Tatz, who brought her own valued contribution to Colin's work. Now, in those many messages sent to the family and in the many published obituaries last year, Colin Tatz was described in words such as these: a fine scholar, clear thinking, a decent, rational and constructive leader, a man with a generous intellectual spirit, with the ability to respect the reasoned beliefs of others while holding very firmly, and I emphasize very firmly, to his own. One colleague wrote that in this increasingly mad world, principle and truth can only be highly prized, and Colin was the epitome. He was born in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1934 and shared a birthday with Nelson Mandela. He was educated at the University of Natal, where he obtained degrees in law and political science, and at the Australian National University, where he obtained his PhD in political science and public administration in 1964. Colin went on to hold professorships at Monash, New England and Macquarie universities, and then later at the Australian National University. He was an invited visiting academic at numerous other tertiary institutions throughout the world. In his long career, he also held 27 other academic and government appointments relevant to his research. He received many honours, including fellowships and an honorary degree and an Order of Australia in 1997. His citation for that AO was as follows, and I quote, "For service to the community through research into social and legal justice for people disadvantaged by their race, particularly the Aboriginal community, and for promoting the equal participation in community life of all Australians." Colin loved to write. His full bibliography is daunting. I can think of no other word, and I'm very much indebted to Karen, his daughter, who's assembled much of that wonderful document. There were 26 published books, 81 chapters in other books, another 148 published reports, monographs and journal articles. There were 7 really interesting exhibitions, in a number of cases with his son, Paul, numerous newspaper articles and essays, and 68 feature articles on sport. His research training and experience began with race politics in South Africa in 1955 and covered another 54 major research projects, including work on employment conditions for Aborigines, law, judges and the courts of sport, Aborigines and the criminal law, suicide, ethnicity and identity in sport, diversity and Jewishness, comparative colonial systems, the Armenian genocide, denialism of genocide in Europe, Turkey and Australia, and the role of sport in Aboriginal communities. Few Australian academics have covered such a broad canvas, if any. Many of Colin's books, and some of which were collaborative with his children, which is very exciting, and very few academics could point to that as well, were launched by public figures, including revered Indigenous leaders, human rights activists, politicians, judges, and sporting heroes. But money, status, public recognition meant very little to Colin Tatz. He had no time for fools or those with an exaggerated sense of entitlement. But when I think of Colin Tatz, I think of what a difference he made in the lives of so many people. He was, as one of his students said, one of those rare individuals who left an indelible mark on others. For Colin, the starting premise was that each individual deserved respect until their actions demonstrated that they didn't. And in Donald Trump's case, he simply rolled his eyes. Colin challenged us to be our better selves, not to waste our talents on the trivial or the material. He challenged us to think deeply about issues, our conduct, and how we were living our lives. He provoked us to look at issues differently, to act in the face of injustice, and to live more worthwhile lives. Generations of students and colleagues throughout the world, many of you I know watching tonight, singled out Colin as the most outstanding teacher and colleague of their lifetime. He urged many students, some I know watching tonight, who had received little formal education early in life to become mature age students. He was patient and generous with the many postgraduate students he supervised, but was always intellectually demanding, intense, stimulating, and very much in demand. But tonight we also remember Colin's wonderful storytelling, his great curiosity, the humility, that striking voice, the generosity and kindness, and some of the less known things about him. He had a fine knowledge and appreciation of classical music and jazz and loved the human voice, although he couldn't sing, but never Wagner. Colin was a very keen golfer, and in a controversial move, much debated in the community, he wrote the history of Royal Sydney Golf Club. He also collected and restored antique golf clubs and gave them away as gifts. He loved and collected fountain pens and special inks and had long-standing relationships with pen shops in many cities. As a younger man, Colin had worked in leather, and the knives in the Tatz household are properly housed in leather sheaths with his personalised hedgehog stamps on them. So when I think of Colin Tatz, I think of how he lived his life, what he has given us, a full and independent life based on research and critical thinking, writing, teaching, communicating. He's left us a great legacy in that written work. That work will be studied for as long as there are people who value learning, who care about understanding the lessons of history and confronting racism, injustice, and anti-Semitism. Colin was very often referred to as a mensch, that lovely Yiddish word to describe a person of integrity, someone to admire and emulate, someone of noble character. Tonight we remember Colin Tatz, the mensch, but also the much-loved husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, friend and colleague. We are all the richer for having known him. So it gives me great pleasure tonight, and I thank the family for the honour of speaking tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Stan Grant, who will give us the first Colin Tatz Memorial Lecture on the topic, Talking with Ghosts, the Haunting of History. Stan is very well known as a television news and political journalist, a television presenter, author of several best-selling non-fiction books, and as a filmmaker. And many of us have enjoyed in the last few weeks his wonderful coverage of the US election. The Wajuri man, Stan is the ABC's International Affairs Analyst, a regular presenter on ABC TV, and a visiting professor at Charles Sturt University. I invite Stan to deliver the oration tonight.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you especially to the Tatz family for giving me this honour. The first of these lectures, I'm really, really incredibly moved and honoured to be able to be here and to share this with you. Thank you so much. And I first met Professor Tatz when I was 17 years old. Not that he would have remembered it, but I was the mail boy at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, wasting my time after high school before I went to university. But I remember him coming in there, and I remember him speaking. And even at that point in my life, when I was still yet to sort of come to grips with the world around me, thinking about the power of his words and the message and the dedication he brought, particularly to the struggle of my own people. So it is a real pleasure to be able to be here tonight. I want to also pay my respects to the people of this land and to the people on whose ever land you may be, from where you're joining us here for this evening. Not far from here, at the old Darlinghurst jail, I went looking for a ghost. It was the ghost of Jimmy Governor. This was the place where he took his last breath. The old jail is now the site of the National Art School. The gallows are gone, but the place is deeply haunted. It's not at all hard to imagine what it once was. I walked down old corridors past what were once cold prison cells. I turned a corner and stopped suddenly. I looked up and my tour guide said, "That's where it happened." Exactly there, she said, where I was standing was where Jimmy was hanged. Above me was where the trapdoor would have been and where the hangman would have placed the noose around Jimmy's neck. Jimmy Governor was executed at 9 a.m. on January 18, 1901. He was a murderer. He killed children. He killed women. He took an axe to a family and then went on a rampage of murder, rape, and theft. 9 people he slaughtered. He became the most hunted man in the country. Jimmy Governor lived and died at the crossroads of our history. He marked a moment between the old and the new, between what was and what was yet to be, a time between time. And that's what draws us to this story, not just the crime, but what the crime represents. Jimmy Governor was an Aboriginal man who at the turn of the 20th century challenged the very idea of this country. He was married to a white woman. He had white ancestry himself. He demanded a place in a white world. In the end, taunted, cheated, humiliated, his white wife rejected and insulted, he struck out violently. Jimmy was executed just 2 weeks after Federation. And here I was, searching for him still, looking back into the past to try to make sense of who I am. More than 100 years after Jimmy died, he still cast a shadow over this nation. Jimmy Governor haunts me and he haunts Australia. He's been immortalised in Thomas Keneally's famous novel, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, of course later a film by director Fred Skepsey. But to me, this is a ghost story. The philosopher Jacques Derrida coined the word hauntology to describe how the traces of our past, our ghosts, throw shadows on our world. It challenges the very idea of modernity, that we in the West can vanquish history itself, that there is an end to history. Not that time stops or that events or people cease to matter, but that we win our freedom. If history is indeed an arc of freedom, then what was I doing standing outside Jimmy Governor's cell? What was the pull of the past, and what is so lacking now that I needed to go in search of a ghost? Derrida went looking for ghosts after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. He saw the dead rising and bringing their histories with them. We know now that history then did not end. It quickly returned, twinned with identity, fueled by vengeance. From China to Russia to Turkey to Hungary to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the rise of the far right, identity has set our world ablaze. In the United States, supposedly a beacon of democracy, identity across race, class, and culture has made the country almost ungovernable. Political scientist Mark Liller has called these seething, angry identity tribes the shipwrecked minds. The shipwrecked minds who see no future, only the past floating by like debris from a wreckage. This is what Jimmy Governor has been to me, a memory of a wound. He is a scar on our history that runs like a fault line between black and white. Jimmy's cell was almost a place of pilgrimage for me. But why? Why would I need this? Why should history have this hold on me? Why am I so haunted by Jimmy's ghost? Jimmy is the spectre that will not let us bury our history. He holds modernity just out of reach. What does it mean to follow a ghost? Derrida asked. And what if this came down to being followed by it always? Persecuted perhaps by the very chase we are leading. The future, Derrida said, comes back in advance, from the past, from the back. We have the bread of apocalypse in our mouths. The French writer Albert Camus said, all revolutionaries finally aspire to world unity and act as though they believed that history were dead. The story of modern times is humanity's struggle with history. History has been buried so many times, and history always returns. In fact, when it comes to history, I'm reminded of the words of the playwright Eugene O'Neill, who said, there is no present or future. There is just the past happening over and over again. We are now at a hinge point of history. To many, our world now looks like Cold War 2.0. China and the United States are locked in an escalating great power rivalry. Shots have already been fired. A trade war between the two biggest economies in the world damaged both countries and weakened global economic growth. China and the US have brushed up against each other in the disputed islands of the South China Sea. It is just one of multiple flashpoints. The Taiwan Strait, the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, claimed by both China and Japan, or the India-China border. All of them could trigger a rapid escalation to a much broader conflict. Just this year, there were casualties when Chinese and Indian troops exchanged fire along their disputed regions. Then there's the nuclear-armed existential standoff between Pakistan and India, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. The Middle East, we know, remains a powder keg from Iraq to Syria to Yemen and Libya. In the Sahel region of Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Ethiopia, terrorism and conflict rage. Relations are toxic between the US and Russia. Vladimir Putin has reasserted Russian power throughout the world, but particularly in the Middle East. He has grown closer to China and Xi Jinping. The post-American world imagined by writer and journalist Fareed Zakaria more than a decade ago is looking more real. The great fear is a war between the two biggest powers on the globe, the United States and China. And the battle plans are already being drawn up. Historians look at this and see, like Eugene O'Neill, the past happening over and over again. They look at the world and they see the same fault lines as 1914. Back then, they said that war would never happen. Germany and Britain were each other's biggest trading partners, and the Kaiser and the King were cousins. How wrong they were. The Australian historian Sir Christopher Clark wrote a magnificent book about how the world drifted to war. He called it sleepwalkers. In 1914, he said, the world was enjoying a great peace. Economies were booming. Trade connected the world, just like today. And then the assassination of an Austrian crown prince in Sarajevo tipped the world into the bloodiest conflict at that point we'd ever seen, the war to end all wars. Christopher Clark says political leaders became hostage to events. Causes trawled from the length and breadth of Europe's pre-war decades are piled like weights on the scale until it tilts from probability to inevitability, he wrote. Now many believe we are sleepwalking to war all over again. The weights are tipping the scales, just like 1914. The Asia-Pacific is a tinderbox of old enmities, expanding militaries, disputed territories, unfinished conflict, and nuclear-armed states. A spark in the South China Sea could set fire to the region, China on one side, the US and allies on the other, with the rest of the world forced into choosing sides. The script for this was written by Thucydides in 400 BC when Athens went to war with Sparta. Today, military strategists warn of what they call the Thucydides trap, when a rising power meets a waning power and go to battle for supremacy. The founding dean of the Harvard University Kennedy School, Graham Allison, fears the world is lurching towards conflict unseen since World War II. He puts his case in a book he called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Allison says we should heed Thucydides' warning from 2,000 years ago. It was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable, he writes. Then it was Athens, Sparta. In 1914, it was Germany, Great Britain, and now China, the United States. As far ahead as the eye can see, the defining question about global order is whether China and the US can escape Thucydides' trap. Most contests that fit this pattern have ended badly, Allison writes. On the current trajectory, he says, war is not just possible, but much more likely than currently recognized. Any clash between the US and China is potentially catastrophic, but as much as we may wish it away, military strategists in Beijing and Washington are preparing for just that eventuality. The global think tank, the Rand Corporation, prepared a report in 2015 for the American military. Its title could not have been more direct: War with China, Thinking Through the Unthinkable. It concluded that China would suffer greater casualties than the US if war was to break out. However, it cautioned that as China's military muscle increased, so would the prospect of a prolonged and destructive war. Australia is in the crosshairs. Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says we are living in a poorer, more disorderly, and more dangerous world. He has increased defence spending and investing in new weapons technology to fight a potential war in the Indo-Pacific. He doesn't mention China by name, but increasing political and military ties with the likes of India and Japan leave no doubt where the threat may lie. China is more assertive, even aggressive. It is fast returning to what it sees as its rightful place at the apex of global power. Xi Jinping is the son of a Communist Party. He puts the party above all. He is crushing dissent, locking up Uyghur Muslim minority, jailing rivals, shutting down the media, and locking up activists. He has made himself president for life. He is a self-styled strongman who has promised his people he will deliver on the China dream. Now, this potential nightmare of a conflict between the big powers of the world comes as authoritarianism is rising and democracy is under attack, if not in retreat. John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States and its second president, once said, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, murders itself. There never was a democracy that did not commit suicide," he said. So is this what we are seeing in our time, an inevitable death of democracy? When I set out on my journalistic adventure in the 1980s, democracy's future looked assured. The second half of the 20th century was boom time for democracy. Germany emerged from the trauma of Nazism. South Africa threw off the yoke of apartheid. Decolonisation across Africa and Asia created new, free, democratic nations. And in other parts of the world, Latin America and Europe, autocratic regimes were swept aside. Between 1970 and 2010, the number of democracies in the world increased from 35 to 120. According to Freedom House, which measures the health of democracy, 63% of the world then lived in democracies. But something has happened. Freedom House in 2015 released its report, Discarding Democracy, the Return of the Iron Fist, which found an erosion in civil liberties and rule of law. It said that democracy was under greater threat than at any point in the last 25 years. So what has happened? History has happened. Let me return to Albert Camus and his vision of the absurd. The divorce between man and his life is properly the feeling of absurdity, he wrote. A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. There is a great feeling of unease in our world. We have lost our grip. People are more wary, more suspicious. Borders and razor wire are going back up to keep people out. We are turning away from each other right at the time when technology has made us more connected than at any time in human history. The sense of alienation has sparked a blowback against globalisation, and immigration has become a flashpoint issue. The political strongman exploits anxiety and fear and the feeling of being overrun, and it is shaking up politics as we know it. Donald Trump, of course, claimed the White House by tapping into this feeling of alienation, a feeling amongst people, and not without reason, that they felt they were losing their own place in their own country. Concerns that Britain lost control of its borders to an open Europe played a big part in the Brexit vote. Politicians on the right are on the rise across Europe, and populists prey on fear and all spin a tale of catastrophe. Islamist terrorism has bitten hard in Europe, and that can't be denied. There are concerns reasonably held that some migrants will not integrate. What we call the global financial crisis, more correctly a depression elsewhere, cost people their livelihoods, their homes, and they have often never recovered. Globalisation promised to make us richer, and it did. Hundreds of billions of people were lifted out of poverty, hundreds of millions rather, lifted out of poverty. But in recent decades, the wealth has not been evenly spread. In established economies and democracies, some have felt left out and spurned. Inequality is growing and people are angry. When Hillary Clinton in 2016 called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, she all but handed Donald Trump the presidency. He told them he would make America great again and that he would save them from American carnage. And they believed him. As Camus said, the hell of the present is his kingdom now. What happened to the end of history? As a young reporter, I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember the words in 1987 of US President Ronald Reagan to his Soviet counterpart Mikhail Gorbachev, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." In 1989, indeed, the wall came down. The Soviet Union was dismantled on December 26, 1991 at 7:32 p.m. when the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. In the United States, a little-known State Department official, Francis Fukuyama, had been looking on and believed he saw not just a pivotal moment for the world, but the very zenith of humanity. He penned an essay published in the National Interest magazine in 1989 with the title, "The End of History." Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy may constitute, quote, "the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, the final form of human government." Fukuyama took his inspiration from the great 19th century German philosopher Hegel. His writings on history helped give birth to the modern world. Hegel believed that the desire for recognition and freedom were the engines of history. History was time and time was progress. We were moving ever forward, he said, to what he saw as the ethical state, the end of history. It was Hegel who first believed he had seen the end of history when he glimpsed the triumphant Napoleon after the Battle of Vienna in 1806. As Hegel said, "I saw the emperor, this world spirit, go out from the city to survey his realm, stretching over the world and dominating it." Hegel may well be proved right, but Francis Fukuyama would have done well to read Camus. "The individual cannot accept history as it is," he wrote. "He must destroy reality, not collaborate with it, in order to affirm his own existence." History is back, and it is back with a vengeance. And its engine is not freedom or recognition, it is vengeance and resentment. The great Irish nationalist poet William Butler Yeats once wrote, "Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This is the return of history. This is what the Indian writer Pankaj Mishra has called the age of anger. And this has been my world. In 30 years of reporting, I have followed that blood-dimmed tide of hate. I've reported on the trail of blood where the ceremony of innocence is drowned. I have stood in bombed-out marketplaces awash in boiling blood with twisted metal and the stench of burning flesh. I've seen mothers picking out what is left of their children from the shell-marked holes in the walls. They place the charred bits of hair and skin into plastic bags because that is all they have left to bury. I've seen how quickly we can turn to violence. I've seen too often the evil we can do. I've seen how easily we can acquiesce to tyranny. As Camus said, in the age of ideologies, we must make up our minds about murder. If murder has rational foundations, then our period and we ourselves have significance. We have made up our minds about murder and we have decided that often we are okay with it. If we weren't, why would we keep committing it as we have done from World War to World War, from Korea to Vietnam, to the Balkans, to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen? We are okay with it. Sometimes it comes to us and it is true. War is necessary. The slaughter of innocents cannot stand. Terrorism can strike in our streets here, and that cannot stand. And so we pick our sides and we do our killing, and we tell ourselves that we are okay with it. We tell ourselves God or history, sometimes they are the same thing, are on our side. As Camus wrote, ideology limits itself to repudiating other people. This leads to murder. Every day, masked assassins slip into some cell. Murder is the question of today. Let me turn again to Yeats. In his poem, The Rose Tree, he imagines a conversation between two Irish rebels, Pearse and Connolly. But where can we draw water, said Pearse to Connolly, when all the wells are parched away? O plain as plain can be, there's nothing but our own red blood can make a right rose tree. Nothing but our own red blood. The blood of vengeance and anger and grievance. It is the blood of identity poured through the strainer of history. Everywhere we see resurgent populism, nationalism, sectarianism, tribalism, and all of it feeds on varying degrees on history. Think of what Xi Jinping tells the Chinese people: remember the 100 years of humiliation by foreign powers. Or Vladimir Putin, who laments the end of the Soviet Empire as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. In Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan reminds his people of the greatness of the Ottoman Empire. In Hungary, Viktor Orban tells his people they were cheated after the end of World War I, when the country lost 2/3 of its territory and vows never again. Islamic State is still fighting the Crusades and continues its dream of rebuilding the caliphate for the final battle of humanity. The German philosopher Nietzsche told us that God is dead, and it seems that we've replaced God with history. As Camus said, between history and the eternal, I've chosen history because I like certainties. History is the poison in the blood of our identities. What the Polish Nobel Prize laureate Czesław Miłosz called the memory of wounds. What Nietzsche warned of as the man of ressentiment. To Nietzsche, the French word goes much further than resentment. Ressentiment is more than harboring a grudge or seething anger. It is the unquenchable thirst for revenge. It is the refusal to let go. Suffering forms the core of identity. To Nietzsche, the man of ressentiment is a prisoner of his past, caught in a time warp. He returns always to the source of injustice that he cannot fix and does not want to fix. In the words of the 19th century Italian poet Giacomo Leopardi, life has shrunk to dregs and rancor. The world is unclean. History for the man of ressentiment is a festering wound to be picked at over and over, never being allowed to heal. His suffering is his strength, his weakness the greatest weapon he has over his oppressor. This ressentiment has lit the fuse of the stories that have shaped my own career. The Indian philosopher and economist Amartya Sen has written extensively about issues of identity and justice. He warns of what he calls solitarist identities, the dangers of limited or restricted ideas of identity. A solitarist approach, he says, can be a good way of misunderstanding nearly everyone in the world. Our shared humanity gets savagely challenged. Singular classifications, he says, make the world inflammable. Put simply, identity can kill, and kill with abandon. So here's a provocative idea. Should we just forget? Why do we make such a fetish of history? Why do we surrender our minds to the past? Truly, we are letting the dead bury the living. Forgetting goes against everything that we are taught. Who doesn't remember George Santayana's warning that those who do not remember the past are bound to repeat it? But what if remembering the past locks us into a cycle of unending, permanent violence? It may indeed bring about the decay of a people, it has been said. If history becomes sovereign, Nietzsche wrote, it would constitute a kind of final closing out of the accounts of life for mankind. To live happily, he says, we must develop the capacity to live unhistorically. In his 2017 book, In Praise of Forgetting, the journalist and philosopher David Reef challenged the adage that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. He warned that thinking about history is far more likely to paralyze than encourage. It becomes a formula for unending grievance and vendetta. Here is the big test. Can we forget? Must we sacrifice justice for peace? These are hard questions. Think about that. We can pursue justice, we can endlessly litigate the past, or we can choose a peace and put the bones of our ancestors to rest and know that their struggle and their suffering released us from their burden. That was the choice facing South Africa at the end of apartheid, justice or peace. It was that simple. They could pursue the crimes of apartheid and prosecute the perpetrators, or they could let the truth set them free. Listen again to the words of Desmond Tutu. Forgiveness and reconciliation, he said, are the only truly viable alternatives to revenge, retribution, and reprisal. Without forgiveness, he said, there is no future. Archbishop Tutu headed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not a Truth and Justice Commission. Justice perhaps would have been easier, and it would have satisfied a lot of people, and it would have electrified the blood of a people with every cause for vengeance. By choosing peace, Tutu set South African people a much higher and a much more godly task. Forgiveness, he said, is not facile or cheap. It is costly business that makes those who are willing to forgive even more extraordinary. But are there crimes so monstrous they cannot be forgiven? The Austrian philosopher Jean Amory refused to let go of the horrors of the Holocaust. He refused to forget what he had seen. He railed against what he called the hollow, thoughtless, utterly false conciliatoriness, or the pathos of forgiveness and reconciliation. His anger was as righteous as Desmond Tutu's love. Amory's words are chilling. What happened? What happened? But that it happened cannot be so easily accepted. I rebel against my past, against history, and against a present that places the incomprehensible in the cold storage of history. Jean Amory was born as Hans Meyer in 1912. His father was Jewish, his mother Catholic. Under new laws passed in 1935, he became legally recognised as Jewish, and in that time, that became a death sentence. In 1938, he fled to Belgium. By 1943, he was caught and tortured by the Gestapo. He was eventually sent to Auschwitz. He arrived with 655 others. 417 were immediately killed. He saw the totality of the brutality of the Nazis and wrote that the world always dies where the claim of some reality is total. Jean Amory never relinquished his resentment. To him, it would have been a betrayal. For him, there would be no place for war monuments acknowledging the Nazi shame or the Jewish suffering. To be a victim alone, he said, is not an honour. I read his words in his extraordinary book, Behind Guilt and Atonement. I hear Amory, and I admit, as someone whose people have suffered in Australia, his words touch me profoundly, deeply, and they trouble me. Am I to hold on to the same resentment, to never forgive? Is forgiving in itself a betrayal? But in the end, I listened to others, to Desmond Tutu and to Nelson Mandela, to those who would free me from history, not chain me to vengeance. And I read the words of Albert Camus, who said, resentment is always resentment against oneself. Jean Amory, who was Hans Meyer, survived the Nazi death camps. He refused to relent in his burning resentment, took his own life at the age of 66 in a hotel room in Salzburg. So what of Australia, where we struggle with reconciliation and our own history? What can a French historian and philosopher teach us? More than a century ago, when in Australia it was still widely presumed that my people, Aboriginal people, were a dying race, Ernst Renan was grappling with the question, what is a nation? What he wrote remains one of the most profound and powerful statements of identity. It was written in 1882. Renan sought to look beyond the grave errors, as he described them, of race or language or religion. He came to his essay he wrote in an absolutely cold and impartial fashion. A nation, he wrote, was defined not by any one thing, but the sum of its many parts, the fusion of the populations that comprise them. Race could be no foundation for nationhood. To Renan, there are no pure races. Race, he said, has always been of diminishing importance. No one, he wrote, has the right to go about the world examining men's heads and then grabbing them by the throat and saying, you are of our blood, you belong to us. The nation, he wrote, was a daily referendum, a perpetual affirmation of life, the search for a collective identity, not a solitarist one. Renan wrote, a nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. It was born of a marriage of the past and the present. One, the possession of a rich trove of memories. The other, actual consent, the desire to live together, the will to continue to value the undivided, shared heritage. Critical to Renan was the question of history. History could bind a nation or it could tear it apart. The study of history, he wrote, often poses a threat to nationality. Renan posed a challenge that resonates with us still today. Forgetting, he said, I would even say historical error, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation. Renan's words sound so incongruous today when we place so much weight on truth-telling. It has become a modern shibboleth that truth can set us free, that there is healing in truth. Perhaps so. As someone who was born into the great Australian silence, whose history, Aboriginal history, was written out of our national story, I know too well history's burden. I cannot easily wish it away, and forgetting for me has not been an option. And yet I know as well from my time in the world the dangers of too much history. I know that truth can also be a weapon. Truth does not always heal. It can torture us and it can turn us against each other. We approach truth with trepidation, and I wonder whose truth? What is truth? Do we not choose the facts sometimes to fit like items in a shop front window? When truth becomes identity, are there no longer facts, just interpretations? As we reckon with our past, we must also know that the past will reckon with us. So let me return again to that spot near where Jimmy Governor was executed. What was I looking for? What did I want from this man, dead now for more than a century? Why should I look to him and his awful crimes for some sort of validation? There have been times in my life when Jimmy Governor has been a symbol, when he has stood in for every face in my family, every humiliation suffered, every injustice visited upon us. In his murderous spree, I foolishly saw some form of vengeance. What I see now is a tragedy. His victims deserve to rest peacefully in our country, and I shall put Jimmy's ghost to rest. I don't know that history reaches its end. We like to believe that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I've seen enough of the worst of the world to know that that is not always true. Sometimes, if it bends at all, it more often bends to power. And power draws on history. History is a tale of unending suffering and humiliation, and that wound is never healed. Instead, it can become our reason for being. Save me from that. In the words of James Joyce, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Walt Secord. I'm the Shadow Treasurer and I'm the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Israel. It's my honor to be asked to provide a vote of thanks. Firstly, let me honor Ilona Lee, plus 61J Media, Mrs. Sandra Tatz and the Tatz family, and most of all, Stan Grant for making the inaugural Colin Tatz Memorial Lecture happen. It's wonderful to see the late Colin Tatz's name and memory honored tonight. This lecture is a fitting reflection on Professor Tatz's contribution to social justice, his lifelong rejection of racism, and his commitment to Tikkun Olam. I'm sorry about that. Speaking personally, I knew and admired Professor Colin Tatz from my first days here in Australia more than 32 years ago. I first encountered Colin Tatz in 1988 when I was a young journalist at the Australian Jewish News. Members of the Sydney Jewish community will be aware that my time at the Australian Jewish News was a continuation of a lifelong association with the Jewish community and most recently the Jewish faith. That all seems a bit unlikely at first glance from a bicultural man who grew up on a First Nation reserve in southern Canada. But perhaps this is not as unlikely when one considers that my upbringing involved two key individuals whose cultures had seen prejudice and racism up close. My late father was a Mohawk Ojibwe First Nation. He grew up one of 10 children, served time in prison for car stealing, and was illiterate. His business partner, my childhood mentor, was a Jewish Holocaust survivor who had lived through the horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau. These experiences instilled in me a need to understand and challenge and bring to light the horrors that racism can produce and the insidious ways in which they can be subtly built. This was formative in my career-long advocacy for genocide acknowledgement and prevention. I visited sites and memorials to the Shoah, including Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, and I've made pilgrimages to sites around the world commemorating the Armenian genocide in Yerevan in eastern Turkey, Halabja in northern Iraq, where Saddam Hussein tried to exterminate the Kurds through chemical attacks in 1988. And in Australia, I've had the honor to speak at the annual Appin and Mile Creek Massacre commemorations. By way of background, and please indulge me here, on December 10, 1838, a group of stockmen led by a squatter rode into Mile Creek Station, and they murdered 28 unarmed Aboriginal men, women, and children. Unfortunately, those murders were not unique at the time. What was unique, but this was the first time Europeans were successfully prosecuted for perpetuating atrocities against the Indigenous people 180 years ago. This was due to the extraordinary efforts a man many decades ahead of his time, the state's Attorney General, John Plunkett. In fact, I serve in the chamber where he was the second president of the Legislative Council. He believed that a Black life and a white life were equal. 11 of the 12 involved were charged with murder and found not guilty. 7 were rearrested and tried again and found guilty and hung on December 18, 1838. This sparked controversy throughout the entire colony. In fact, even Plunkett's own wife spoke against him. There was condemnation in the Sydney press, including the Sydney Morning Herald. The Appin and Mile Creek massacres should remind us that no country is uniquely prone or uniquely immune to the horrors that prejudice unchallenged can produce. There was one lesson that the settlers took out of the Mile Creek massacre and the prosecutions. It wasn't not to do it again. It was to do it in secret and not talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, one of the great challenges of prejudice that Australia produced is Mr. Stan Grant. As a Maori female banking executive said to me at a business function several days ago, "You cannot be what you cannot see." When I was a young bicultural man in rural Canada, I felt the same. My sister and I were the only 2 bicultural children at the reservation school. Well, I've seen and heard you stand over the decades, locally and internationally on CNN. You've been a trailblazer in the media and in public debate, and you've inspired many to find their voice, and you've inspired others to listen to voices that they were reluctant to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit, I'm deeply disappointed that Stan Grant has not opted for a political life.
Australia may well be better off because of that.
I won't betray any confidences, but this is despite speculation that various political parties have tried to court you. Your lecture tonight indicates why they were, and indeed, I am sure they are still so eager to get you into federal parliament, but I digress. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for being a most fitting speaker for this first lecture, named in the honor of a great advocate for equality, humanity, and justice, the late Professor Colin Tatz AO. Thank you for your support of the memory and legacy of Professor Colin Tatz. I thank you and good evening. Thank you.